I am privileged to be here with Lori Kay, one of our
Thank you.
illustrious guests. Thank you for being at the fest this weekend, Lori. We are glad to have you here. And Lori has a beautiful book, Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper. She has interviewed many, many, many famous rock and roll personalities over the years, and she's going to tell us a little bit about that. And then she's going to tell us about the interview that she did with John Lennon. But I'm not going to tell you more. I'm going to let Lori tell you a little bit about herself and about her book and about other things that are going on.
The title of my book is actually Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview, which I co-conducted for RKO Radio mere hours before he was shot and killed on December 8th, 1980 at the Dakota. So we're coming up to the 45th anniversary this December 8th, which is heartbreaking. I've just been through so much. I still consider that day both the best and the worst day of my life because it was such horrible news to hear after spending an incredible, almost entire day with John and Yoko at the Dakota. And he was just amazing. And my book is not a Beatles bio, it's my memoir. It's the story of my early rock radio related life and career wrapped around what tragically turned out to be John Lennon's last day on the planet. And it's just means so much to me. And it was so horrible afterwards. What happened was the guys on my RKO radio team dropped John and Yoko off at the recording studio where they had a session to work on their album After Double Fantasy. And I was staying in New York that night. I was the only one not going back to the West Coast of us. And so I was standing outside the Dakota and I was approached by a really creepy guy who kept bugging me saying, "Did you talk to him? Did you get his autograph? What'd he say? What'd he say? What'd he say?" And he kept following me down the sidewalk because I was on my way to my friend's office who I was going to eat dinner with and spend the night with. And I kept trying to get rid of him and he wouldn't leave. And I was going to go to the Dakota security department and say, "Get rid of this guy. He's bugging me and he must be about to bug other people." But I didn't. I just kept walking faster and acting like I was going to smack him. And he kept saying it over again. "Did you talk to him? Did you get his autograph? What'd he say? What'd he say?" And hours later, when I found out that John had been shot before they announced that he was killed, I thought, uh-oh, I have a feeling it must have been that guy. And sure enough, when I saw the news later that night and they showed the guy that they'd arrested and the guy who'd confessed, it was the guy who'd been following me and bugging me. And all I wanted to do was just hurt myself because I felt so guilty. Why didn't I report him to the security department? Why didn't I call the police? Why didn't I realize that he was carrying a gun in the coat that he was wearing in the pocket? And that's the guilt that's basically stuck with me over all these years, about 45 years.
You could not have known that. You could not have known that. You know, I know, but I understand. I think every one of us in the room understands that. But you could not have known.
Yeah. Well, I should say that my book, of course, features many details and quotes and amazing impressions from that awesome interview with John Lennon, as well as from a number of meetups with other musicians I've been lucky enough to talk with over the years. Everyone from Fab Four members George Harrison and Paul McCartney, plus Beatles producer George Martin, and he was great too. And Beatles idol Little Richard. That was an incredible interview that I did for Rock Magazine as opposed to for RKO radio specials. And tons more favorite artists and bands of mine over the years, from the Ramones to Talking Heads, Mick Jagger, David Bowie, you name it. I tried to interview them and I was lucky enough to be able to. And when it comes to my life story, I use my book to explain how music made it possible for me, starting out as a toddler, to successfully survive my difficult, dysfunctional family upbringing. And thanks so much ever since to the parts that sex and drugs and rock and roll have all played throughout my life. And Something I realized while considering writing my memoir was that unless you've kept a daily diary and written down what goes on in your life every day of the year, which unfortunately I never ever did, not even when I was in elementary school, junior high, or high school, lifetime memories can be really hard to get back to, especially the older you get, like I am. And plus, if you're not a celebrity, which I'm not, getting a literary agent and publisher to be interested in your memoir can also be extremely difficult unless you're willing to self-publish, which I never was. That's always scared me. So lucky for me, I was able to make it work. My writing did really well, and I found a traditional independent publishing company that was super eager to read my self-edited first draft, and then they sent me a contract right away and published my book, and it's been really popular. And people say when they read it that they don't put it down. They don't read just a few pages at a time and put it down and go back later. They want to read it all at once. So that makes me feel great. And I hope if you haven't read it, you will. I'll be selling the book here later and also upstairs at the table on the 9th floor, but you can buy it here if you care to. And I will say that there's a number of reasons that it took me nearly 40 years, almost 4 decades, to start writing my book since the afternoon I spent with John and Yoko. And not only was I feeling much too miserable and, yes, extremely guilty, like I said before, to sit down and put together my story on paper, but I was also concerned about embarrassing my mother, since I knew I'd need to truthfully describe her decayed single mom treatment of me throughout my childhood and my teen years. And I was also far too busy contemplating and slowly but surely coordinating my upcoming career changes after John got killed, since I felt the need to leave radio. I just didn't want to be in there anymore that once he'd passed. And so I made the move from on air to print and then over to TV and video writing and production for decades. And my freelance and far beyond full-time gigs kept me wrapped up multiple hours of each and every day and night of the week. So sadly, I had no time or energy to even think about concentrating on or coming up with my book. And this was despite the fact that, as I say in my introductory first chapter, which I eventually started writing in 2020, following both my mother's passing away and the pandemic, because that pretty much put my TV production work to a complete close. Whenever anyone found out over the years that my RKO team and I had conducted John Lennon's final interview, jaws dropped, people gasped, and the inevitable question is asked, Lori, when are you going to write your book? And finally, I was able to answer, now. And so I did, and it's out. And I'm really excited to hear what people think about it and to read their reviews everywhere from Amazon to print. And I've done so many podcasts and radio shows and TV shows, and people have all really liked my book. And believe it or not, the coolest comment that ever convinced me to write my memoir actually came from John Lennon himself. After he begged me to let him autograph, along with Yoko Ono, the copy of her great book, Grapefruit, which I brought to the Dakota with me, and they were super excited to see because they both said, oh, we haven't seen this edition in years. And John begged me, after Yoko did, to let me have him autographed it too, since he had written the introduction to the book. So I said, of course, and I thanked him profusely, and he was thrilled to be able to. And he made a point of telling me how much he himself loved it when authors signed their books for him. So I, of course, told him that if and when I ever wrote mine, I'd definitely send him an autographed copy. And he smiled at me like crazy, pushed down his glasses, and said, great, Lori, which made me feel even more than great. So that's what enabled me to be able to write my book. And I just wish I could send it to him, you know. That's the one thing I really wish, that he could see it up in heaven, you know. But I'm lucky I did get to meet his son, Sean, finally. And he was 5 years old when I did the interview with John and Yoko. And he wasn't there during the interview, of course. He was out with his nanny hanging around town that day. But I had brought him a toy. And so I gave it to Yoko and John, and it was about this high. It was a walking and wind-up metal fire-breathing dragon. And I thought, oh, any kid is going to like this. And I'd gotten it at a Chinese store at Chinatown in San Francisco, where I was staying. And Yoko looked at it and said, oh my God, I love this. And John's going to love this. And we may love it too much. We may not want to give it to Sean. And I thought, oh no. And sure enough, when John came and was able to play with the toy, and he wound it up and walked it up and down the coffee table in front of the love seat that he was sitting right next to me on. And he said, I don't know that I'm going to give it to Sean. And I thought, whoa. And so after John was killed, all I could think about for over 40 years was, did Sean ever get the toy I brought? Or did it hurt Yoko's feelings to think of giving it to him, to remind her of John being killed because of our interview? And so I never was able to get a hold of Sean. So I never found out until this past year when I met Sean at the screening of the movie that he produced, War is Over, which ended up winning an Academy Award. And I said, oh, Sean, I'm so glad to meet you. I did the last interview with your father, and he was thrilled to meet me, and I gave him a signed copy of my book for him and his mother, and he was so excited. And I said, and now I have to ask you, did Yoko ever give you the toy that I brought you to the interview that day? And he said, toy? What toy? And I said, well, it was a wind-up, fire-breathing dragon that walked along, and your dad played with it. And he went, oh my God, that was my favorite toy as a kid. And I was so thrilled. I almost started crying. It was so great to hear that from him. And that's how I feel, as I did something right. I brought him a cool toy.
Awesome.
Yeah. So between that and bringing my copy of Grapefruit and having them sign it, and I still have it now, and I look at it every day. And in my book, I put the autographs that they gave. So everybody who gets my book will have John and Yoko's autograph too, from the last day he spent on the planet. So I hope you all get it and check it out and see it.
So you said that you wanted to read us an excerpt and play us some audio. So
Well, let's see. What I'll do is I can read the first page and a half of my first chapter. People would like to hear that.
sure.
And I should tell you that it's chapter 1 called Imagine, My Lead Up to Lennon. And I should mention that every single chapter of my book, all 18, are named after one of my favorite rock and roll, pop, or musical songs. So this, of course, is named after one of my favorite songs ever, Imagine. Love that. And here it is. Here's the first page and a half. On December 8th, 1980, I was overflowing with excitement, anticipation, and disbelief as I approached the Dakota Apartments on Manhattan's Upper West Side. I was there to play my part in John Lennon's one and only U.S. radio interview following the release of his and Yoko Ono's brand new album, Double Fantasy. And the voices in my head were telling me that this was without a doubt about to become the best day of my life that I could ever even begin to imagine, and that I was truly the luckiest person on the planet. And visions of thousands of screaming Beatles fans packed into my Dodger Stadium day so many years earlier swirled through my brain like milkshake in a blender, and I could barely keep myself from swaggering down the sidewalk as my associates and I approached the security booth area right outside the Dakota's entrance. I'd flown out one day earlier from the West Coast as part of our 3-member RKO Radio team, along with an executive from Warner Brothers Geffen Records. And although our RKO Radio trio had already worked together on a number of attention-getting network radio rock specials and interviews over the past few years, including heading off to London just the year before with Paul McCartney and Wings, this would be an entirely different ballgame. After all, we were on the verge of meeting up with someone who'd literally disappeared from the music business for the previous 5 years, John Lennon. And John had been hunkered down in the role of ultra happy house husband and attentive father ever since his 18-month-long lost weekend, the time during which he was, by his own admission, miserably separated from Yoko and living in Los Angeles. And he hadn't recorded or released any new music in at least the 5 years since. But now Double Fantasy, the new album created with his often critically reviled wife Yoko Ono, was his way of opening the door to the 80s and a whole new era. No one else in the world could even begin to imagine how it felt to realize that we were about to become the only American radio gang chosen to help John and Yoko usher that era in. And the build-up to our interview had already begun somewhat mind-blowing. At one point, while everything was still in the early planning stages, I got a call from someone asking the date, the year, and time of my birth, because apparently Yoko was working with her personal astrologer, who was going to take all the information collected and then use it to put together an astrological chart that would then determine the best possible day for our Dakota meetup. Of course, the surprising thing is that even with all that intimate information, and despite the fact that John and Yoko had already planned to head to Hawaii and the West Coast during that time period, somehow Monday, December 8th, 1980, a date that will live forever in freakish rock and roll infamy, was chosen. Our flight to the Big Apple alone had been a total trip, with celebrities like British actor Anthony Hopkins and former heavyweight champion Ken Norton on board. Although I barely had the opportunity to say hello to Hopkins, who had just starred in the widely celebrated film The Elephant Man, I was excited to meet Ken Norton. Standing next to the massive boxer as he towered over me seemed to put my whole life in perspective. And I remember that as we shook hands, it felt like my digits were being enveloped by a huge Hormel ham. My main goal on that flight to New York was to come up with an amazing list of questions for John and Yoko. We'd been warned well in advance that asking about John's time with the Beatles was a definite no-no. So as I wrote out my thoughts regarding the recording process and inspiration behind the various songs on Double Fantasy, I also shuffled through the Playboy magazine interview with Lennon that had just hit the newsstands. And with each page, I became more and more convinced that I was about to be torn to shreds by my idol. It seemed to me that John had not only been adamant about talking to the writer about not wanting to talk about the Beatles, but his past in general. And I began to get the scary feeling that we were all about to be slammed by his superior intellect and wit. I knew also that his personality was notoriously complex, and the last thing I wanted was for him to think that I was some foolish, undereducated fangirl who still saw him as the smart Beatle while letting stupid questions with obvious answers pour from my mouth. So that's almost the first 2 pages of my book, and I have to say that John was truly super complimentary towards me throughout the entire interview, the several hours we spent together. And he couldn't wait, he and Yoko both, to make plans and get together 2 weeks after the interview, when he said that he and Yoko were going to be in San Francisco. So we made plans to get together and have dinner at Yoko's favorite Japanese restaurant. And not only am I a sushi and sashimi fan, so I was excited about that, but just excited about being able to talk about all kinds of personal things with John and Yoko. You know, I wanted to find out about relationships from Yoko especially, because she was great at them, as was John, and I had been as you'll read in my book, not so great in relationships up to that point. I was fairly in my young 20s. And I couldn't wait to talk to John about all the things that we had in common. Very similar family upbringings, not really being raised by our mother or even meeting our father for years and years and years. And that was just so exciting for me to think of. Also, John and I had something else amazing in common. We both loved the time that we spent on Bali in Indonesia. He had been there for vacation, and I had been there living there, studying Balinese dance, and for nearly a year. And I was thrilled, and John was telling me, wow, and I told all my friends how cool it was and how they should go. I said, John, that's exactly what I did. And that was just one of the first things I felt like I had amazingly in common with him. He was so great to talk to. He's just such a wonderful person. And that's just one of the reasons that it hurt me so hard to find out first that he'd been shot and then that he was killed after getting shot.
I think that it's, everything leading up to this is very interesting as well. I would suggest that, like I said, like Lori said, she has copies of the book if you want to see it before when we're done. You can buy a book from her, or you can go upstairs to see her on the 9th floor before things close up there. But you've done so many interviews. I mean, obviously, the one with John is the one people remember most. But you did so many other wonderful things, and you interviewed so many other interesting people, all of which are mentioned in the book. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, and then maybe we can take some questions from the audience as well, if you like.
Sure. Well, I can do that. I can take questions, or would you like to hear John Lennon first and George Harrison?
Yeah.
Because I thought, yeah, let's play quotes from the guys, the Beatles, the late great Beatles, because you can still hear Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr on radio and TV and stuff now, but you can't really hear John and George talk anymore. So can we go ahead and play? It will be the, this is my interview with George Harrison was really cool, and I should say that it was for 2 specials that I was writing for RKO Radio. The first one was the Beatles from Liverpool to Legend, my 17-hour worldwide special, and the second one it was for was from the top 100 of the 70s, because George was having songs on that. So I talked to him right after he got married and had the son, married to Olivia, and this is a cool quote from him.
I want to, first of all, congratulate you on your new baby and on your marriage.
Thanks a lot.
And I'm going to ask you about your new album. Do you have a title for it yet?
No, actually, that's one thing I don't have is a title, so I'm just going to put the album out. It's called George Harrison.
What is
$60 million say you get the new George Harrison album. That's what they always say anyway.
What kind of feel does the album have? I mean, a lot of your other work has been spiritual and religious. What kind of feeling does the album have?
Well, I think all the songs on it are very optimistic sort of songs. They're not, I wouldn't call them spiritual songs. In fact, I don't think they're spiritual at all. I mean, in the sense that you mean, like My Sweet Lord or something like that. It's not like that type of song. But I think, in many ways, it's sort of typical George Harrison tunes. They have, the same slide guitars and still be singing. But the album is just a very up album. And all the songs are the sort of music that has melodies to them, the long, sort of noisy sort of songs. They're all melodious.
So that was a brief piece of my George Harrison interview, and although it went on for quite a bit longer, it was just so great to talk to him and to hear him talk about how happy it was, and what he enjoyed most of life wasn't being in the studio and wasn't the idea of going on tour. It was being in his backyard doing gardening and taking care of his little son, Danny, and being with his wife, Olivia. And so that was really wonderful to hear. Anybody have any questions about George? Or I can go ahead and play the, this isn't just a piece of the John Lennon interview. What it is I wrote the special after John Lennon died, John Lennon, the Man, the Memory, that aired around the world. And the engineer who recorded the interview put together promos. And this is the second promo that he put together. And it's the one I'm playing first because it's the answer to my question, which was, what got you to start doing music again after 5 years, John? And he was thrilled to have me ask that because he was tired about talking, raising his son. And so this is the promo.
John Lennon, the final interview. Came over me all of a sudden, though I didn't know what came over me. Yes, I was possessed by this rock and roll devil, you know.
Partly because suddenly I got the songs, just suddenly I had, if on the expression, diarrhea of creativity. In fact, we went in the studio and cut about 22 tracks and so cut it down to 14 to make the dialogue. They were all dialogue songs, meaning that we were writing as if it was a play and we were the two characters in it, but it's real life, but not real as well. But we always worked from our own selves as near as we could. The album, the work we did on this thing is really a play, and what we sing about in the record and the songs are real diaries of how we feel, but also it's always not really real because it's a song and it's on a record and you project it in a different way.
John Lennon, the final interview.
Would you like to hear another one? Okay, let's play the number 4, the promo number 4, which is basically about why he's enjoying making music again.
John Lennon, the final interview.
After 10 or 15, almost 20 years of being under contract and having to produce 2 albums a year in the early days and a single every 3 months, regardless of what the hell else you were doing, it's like the channels on the radio jammed, you know. I was not getting clear signals. And Paul and I turned out a lot of songs those days, but then it got to be format and sort of not the pleasure that it was. And that's when I felt that I'd lost myself. Not that I was purposely being a hypocrite or phony, but it took something away from what I set out to do. I started out to do rock and roll because I absolutely liked doing it. I think it's a serious piece of work, but it's also something cheap, you know. I mean, I went right back to my roots. It's not going back to being Beatles John in the 60s, it's being John Lennon, whose life was changed completely by hearing American rock and roll on the radio as a child, and that's the part of me that's coming out again. That's why I'm enjoying it, as I enjoyed it originally.
John Lennon, the final interview.
I just almost start crying every time I hear him talk like that. It's just amazing. And there's one more that you might want to hear where he talks about how he wants to keep living for years and to keep working. So promo 7.
John Lennon, the final interview.
You have to give thanks to God or whatever it is up there, the fact that we all survived. We all survived Vietnam or Watergate or the tremendous upheaval of the whole world that's changed. We were the hit ones in the 60s, but the world is not like the 60s. The whole map's changed. And we're going into an unknown future, but we're still all here. We're still, while there's life, there's hope. And whoever's listening must have come through or they wouldn't be here. And that's because I would consider my work one piece, whether it be with Beatles, David Bowie, Elton John, Yoko Ono, and I consider that my work won't be finished until I'm dead and buried, and I hope that's a long, long time.
John Lennon, the final interview.
It was probably 5 hours after he said that he was dead and buried. They're not buried, but dead. Just makes me so tragic. Does anybody have any questions? I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Yes, sir.
Right here, yes.
Oh, I'm curious. It sounds like he was totally open and relaxed and friendly, but the sort of reputation, or you were worried about making him talk about didn't want to talk about this and whatever. Do you think did you do something to open him up, or was he just in a good mood, or what? Why was it such a great conversation?
Well, it wasn't that I didn't want to talk about the Beatles or his past. I really did, but I was told not to by the record company and by, I told you the Playboy magazine interview was obvious I shouldn't. And so I didn't, but John brought it up himself, which was really cool. So once he did, then we sort of started asking little questions, and he didn't seem to mind. And he told us all about his first meetup with Paul McCartney. That was incredible. And his first meetup with Yoko at the art gallery, and then their first date 2 years later. And that was the time they first recorded their first album, also on that date, and made love for the first time, and decided to stay together. And that was just so cool to be able to hear, even though I knew I'd read about it before for the most part, just to be able to hear him talk about it and see Yoko nodding and being so happy. And they were just so thrilled to be back together. It was just so exciting.
I think the real thing is that he brought it up, so it was okay to talk about it if he wanted to talk about it. I've heard that happen in other interviews.
Exactly, yes. So,
anyone have any other questions for Laurie? Yes.
How optimistic did he seem about the new material, new song?
he seemed really excited, as did Yoko, because what they basically told us, and this is in my book also, is that they both wanted to create a discussion for couples to have, men and women, to make their relationships in the 80s much better than they were in the 70s, because that's when they'd had their problem. So they figured, since they created double fantasy by doing a discussion with songs, John wrote a song and Yoko heard it and then wrote a song back for him, and then he wrote a song back for her. So that was the same as having a discussion, many, many songs back and forth. And he wanted to encourage, as I said, other couples to do that, so they would have really happy relationships. And he was thrilled to be with Yoko and to be, as I said, caring for his son and be a house husband and all that. And he was also thrilled to be back in the studio in a way, even though Sean told him, 5-year-old Sean said, "I wish you were just my full-time daddy." He didn't want him to be in the studio and working as a musician, but John was obviously convincing him, because Sean himself now performs as well and, is into that. But it was very exciting to see how thrilled John was going to be. And we asked him, well, what do you think? Would you be doing live shows, tours? And he said, well, I didn't really want to unless I could with Yoko, but the guys, our studio musicians, really want to go on tour. So I'm thinking that we just might, but the thing is, I don't know what venues I want. I don't know if I want to do great big venues like the Beatles did. I might want to do small ones, but then critics might be really nasty about it if, say, oh, he couldn't get the big venue sold out. So he wasn't sure, when and where he was going to be doing shows. But all I could think about was, oh, I can't wait to see you live. Yeah. Because he didn't sing or play during our interview, except very briefly he sang imitating Yoko, which was really cool, being very complimentary, and a little bit of one of his previous songs, Imagine, because he was explaining that he should have credited Yoko with co-writing that song, because her book, Grapefruit, is all about imagining, basically. So he said that he should have credited her. And she said, yeah, but you dedicated the album to me, that's fine. And he said, oh, yeah. But he wanted to credit her. And then Also, he imitated Paul singing Yesterday, saying that when they did go on tour, if he and Yoko and the studio musicians did, he would not want to sing Beatles songs or even songs from his solo past. And he started singing Yesterday, saying, nope, I don't want to do that. And he was just great. He was just so funny and so fun to talk to. And as I mentioned, when he came in for the interview, he sat down right next to me on the love seat that I was sitting on. And I was just so thrilled looking at him, thinking, oh my God, am I dreaming? Is this really happening? Am I sitting next to John Lennon? I mean, just inches away. And he would keep looking at me, like I said, I think before, with his glasses and pushing them down. And when I would ask a question, he would say, yes, exactly. Yes, love. And so I've never felt so validated probably by an interviewee in my entire life. Even though my interviews with George Harrison and George Martin and Paul McCartney were all wonderful, I still felt like John thought that I was special and really liked the questions. And I was thrilled. And it was wonderful also to be interviewing with Dave Sholin, who is the music director at RKO Radio and KFRC when I started there in the news department and was a newscaster. And he asked a lot of the questions that I came up with, and some of his own, of course, and also Bert Keane, the Warner Brothers record executive, who's unfortunately just passed away earlier this year. He had a couple questions to ask too, and even our engineer and producer Ron Hummel, he came up with a question to ask too, because when John Lennon's sitting there, you just of course want to talk to him, and you of course want to take a picture with him and get his autograph, and we all did. And my book cover is the picture of me with John and Yoko. Actually, the real picture is a color picture, but the guy who did my book cover, who is a Grammy award-winning album cover creator, Mick Haggerty, wanted to use it for the book cover too, and I said, sure, go ahead. And he did a great book cover, I think, so it's been very popular.
I think it's interesting when you're talking about him wanting to tour in 1981, and we all kind of wished he would. You know, I do remember. I'm pretty sure I heard your interview at the time, but I also remember hearing that he wanted to tour and being so excited about that. And I remember my dad saying to me, because my father thought scalpers and ticket brokers, well, there wasn't such thing as scalpers, were terrible, and he wasn't going to pay a whopping $50 for a ticket, you know. But he promised me. He said to me, if John Lennon comes around, I'll get you a ticket. Cool. And of course, it was never meant to be, unfortunately, but it would have been nice to have heard him say that. You know, it's just, he was very excited. I mean, he was in a very different place in his life, you know, and you got to feel that in the room, which I think is amazing.
Yeah, and the hardest thing afterwards was after finding out that he was shot and killed, and I ended up at the RKO Radio Network in New York doing interviews all night around the world with radio people and print people. And then the next morning they put me on the Today Show having to talk about it, and I was just so tragic and sad. And if you go to my website, actually, you can see my appearance on the Today Show. And the thing is that then I got on the airplane right away and went back to San Francisco and immediately listened to the hours-long interview and started writing the special, which I titled John Lennon, the Man, the Memory. I love coming up with titles for all the specials. Like the Beatles from Liverpool to Legend is one of my favorite titles, and John Lennon, the Man, the Memory as well. But it was so hard for me to write the special because I was in the hotel room and I kept crying the whole time as I was writing it and dedicating it to Yoko Ono. And then I turned it in to Ron, the engineer producer at KFRC, and he put the show together and created those promos that you heard and plenty of others. And the show aired. It was originally not supposed to air until Valentine's Day in '81 because Double Fantasy was a loving album. But of course, with John being shot and killed, it aired much sooner. It aired 6 days after he was killed, on the Sunday after, the same day that Yoko had everybody keep quiet for 10 minutes to, just originate John's passing and everything. And so the show aired all over the country, all over the world, and I'm glad people listened to it. All the laughters ended up being cut out, and all the ringing of the phone, because the phone rang a lot while we were in there, Yoko's phone, and it turned out to be a really great interview and an especially good special, 3-hour special.
It's sad that that's how it ended up being and that you rushed it through. But on the other hand, it was preserved for posterity, and the fact that it came out on that day that Yoko asked people to honor John, I think is actually fitting because it was honoring him as well. So it may not have been silent, but it was honoring him as well. And those of us who were around got to work wherever we could, wherever they were having a vigil, and they were having them everywhere. I'm sure there was one in San Francisco. There was one in New York. I didn't get to it. I was at school on Long Island. So I went to one on Long Island. But, and it's alternating between, wow, this happened, and utter tragedy, you know? So it's hard, it's like when I went to the thing on Long Island, a friend of mine and I ended up on the front page of the Long Island newspaper the next day. And I'm sure people may have said similar stuff to you. They said to me, oh, your 15 minutes of fame. And my response was, I would rather there'd never been a reason for this, And so when you probably have that sort of bittersweet memory, because you had spent this wonderful afternoon with this man who was so happy and so alive, and then it was so tragically cut short. And I can't even imagine. That is so. Oh.
That's why I say I still look at it after all these years, almost 45, as the best and the worst day of my life. And I still feel, whenever I hear John's voice or see a picture of him, and they're all over my house at home in LA, I still feel so sad and so full of guilt. And everything I try to get rid of the guilt, it doesn't work, unfortunately. I wish it did.
It's hard, but like I said before, you could not have known. I mean, that's just one of those crazy things in life, but hindsight is 20/20, and you kind of look at it and go, I could have stopped this. I could have done something, and I didn't. And it's not you. I just so you know, it's not you. And certainly you didn't do anything, but I understand, because it's especially after spending that day with him, Does anybody have any other questions for Laurie, or any comments they want to make about, yes?
Laurie, I have your book, which is fabulous. It's really awesome. You have a really fascinating career.
Thank you.
The way you set the scene for an interview with John is just great. So I was thinking about what you just said about how he sat down on the love seat, just inches away from him. Can you remind me? Where specifically did the interview take place?
Well, I should tell you that when we got to the Dakota, their assistants took us into the main office, which I didn't want to be in at all, because I didn't want to be with them. And they said, well, John and Yoko are still up stairs in their apartment with their Rolling Stones photographer taking the pictures. And when they'll be done, they'll be coming down. You'll be interviewing them in Yoko's private office, which was actually both of their private office. So we said, fine.
So it's like his own space, it's like his office.
Right.
His own space. Yeah.
So they took us into that office, and it was so cool. There was a shag carpeting, a white shag carpeting that was like this high off the ground. So they said, now take off your shoes to walk on it. And I did. And the first thing I saw was this incredible coffee table, this long glass coffee table with metal legs, and winding their way up the legs were metal snakes. And throughout the whole interview, I kept looking down, going, am I imagining this? Is this real? And the love seat, the reason I sat there was that it was right in front of the coffee table where I wanted to be. And I thought, yeah, and when John and Yoko decide to play with the toy I brought for Sean, they'll want to play with it on the coffee table. And the first person to come down was Yoko, because she said, John is still upstairs. He's doing some solo shots with Annie Leibovitz, the photographer. And I immediately thought, oh God, I hope she doesn't come down, because I had had a horrible experience with her during my time as a newscaster in Seattle. And she was really insulting. And I thought, if she comes down, I'm going to say something nasty to her. And I don't want to do that in front of John and Yoko. But anyway, so Yoko came down, and she was really happy to see me, because I was the only other gal in the room. It was all, the other three guys. So she was thrilled to see me. And we started talking about relationships and double fantasy and putting it together and writing songs and all that. And then after about 20, 25 minutes, maybe a half an hour, the door started to open, and we knew that it was going to be John. And the door inched open like a couple inches, and we saw glasses sticking through and a nose. And as he walked in and stuck his face in, I couldn't help it. I pushed down my microphone and I looked at him and I said, kind of underneath my normal voice, "Can't you tell we're in the middle of an interview?" And he started laughing, and that's when he came in and sat right next to me and started saying, "Yeah, great, good to sit next to you." And it was very exciting, and it has been in my mind ever since.
It's funny. Now, I've heard this said by other people who have interviewed or worked with many celebrities, that there are some celebrities that are beyond that celebrity, if you know what I mean. They're not intimidated by much, but when a certain person walks into the room, all of a sudden, all speech and coherent thought is gone. So I can imagine all the people that you've interviewed. I mean,
Yes.
I heard a woman who was a book editor, and she worked with a lot of rock and roll people like you, and she said if Paul McCartney walked into the room, and she just lost the capacity for speech.
Oh.
So I can imagine it's. He seems like he was so happy and trying to put you at ease, but I cannot imagine if you recovered your capacity to talk, you are doing better than I would have. That's all I can say.
Well, as I say in the book, my interview with Paul McCartney and Linda and their latest lineup of Wings was amazing. And what we brought for Paul was a big bottle of his favorite booze. And he was so thrilled that what he did and Linda did is they started rolling joints and handing them to us. And we all passed them around. We were smoking pot during the interview. And then after the interview, which was hours long also, he was so thrilling. He treated me like we were doing a dance together and hugged me and kissed me, and we took an incredible picture together, me and Linda and Paul, and that was thrilling too. And that was the orders of my Beatles interviews. First was George Harrison, and then that was late 1978, and then Paul McCartney was in June 79, right before Back to the Egg came out, the last Wings album, as it turned out. And then John Lennon, actually, George Martin, the producer, was January 1980, right after his book, All You Need Is Ears, came out, and he was super complimentary, having heard my Beatles show that I wrote and co-produced, Beatles from Liverpool to Legend. And then John was, 11 months after that. So that was amazing. And the unfortunate thing is, after the John Lennon interview and after he was shot and killed, I didn't want to interview any more musicians at all. But as they told me from RKO, no, you've already made plans. We've already booked you. You have interviews coming up in just a couple days. And I went, oh my God. And my first interview was Dwight Yoakam. And that was, he was actually a good interview, so that was okay. But after that, an even better interview was Barry Manilow. And because John had talked about Barry Manilow music during our interview a bit, so that made me feel good talking to Barry. And he obviously felt that too, because after I talked to him and wrote the special for RKO Radio, Barry Manilow heard it and wrote a letter to RKO and to me saying, "That's the best radio special I've ever been on. That was the best radio interview I've ever done." And so that made me feel thrilled. And after that, I just kept interviewing everybody that I possibly could get hired to do. And It was tons and tons of people. And one of my favorites of all times after that was the Little Richard interview, which was
so cool.
hours and hours long. And that was for Rock Magazine. That was a print interview. And it was wonderful because he talked a lot about the Beatles and what fans he was of them and they were of him. And very
that
cool.
Must have been amazingly awesome.
It was.
There was that PBS special about him, and just watching that, but to talk to him, that must have been so amazing. Yeah,
it was.
Anyone have questions? Yes.
What was your least favorite?
Oh, my least favorite interview. That's really hard to even remember. I think I probably pushed it out of my head. Yeah, it's actually it's one of the it was one of the local punk rock bands in San Francisco that was not enjoyable to interview at all.
Yes.
Yes.
If you were still pursuing interviews, which subjects that are out there today would you definitely want to have a chance to interview?
Which
Who
artists?
would you interview now? Yeah.
Well, I'd actually want to interview a lot of my favorites from years ago. Like I just saw in the last couple of years the Steve Miller Band, who was one of my favorite bands years ago, and seeing them now, all these years later, live, Steve Miller was incredible. And all I could think about was, oh, I want to talk to you. How do you still have such a great voice and play still such great guitar? And I wanted to ask him, was he still writing great songs? And that was wonderful. And when my husband, Kurt, who's back there, go back to LA after this fest, we're going to be seeing AC/DC, one of my favorite bands. I would love to interview them because one of the things I did years later was create and produce what they call rock video magazines for BMG. And I did Metalhead. So of course I was a heavy metal fan. So AC/DC was always big to me. And one of my favorite video magazines to do was to create was country music video magazine. And I did a lot of great interviews for that. Everybody from Garth Brooks to you name it. I interviewed him. I was spent a lot of time in Nashville doing that. And that was the early 90s. That was thrilling. So I hope that answered your question.
Sort of. Yeah, I think he's talking about anybody who's contemporary to today, not from the past.
Oh.
You know, is there somebody you might think would be an interesting interview?
Alalas. I like the Alalas. Kurt and I go see them all the time they play. And then I have another friend who has a band who's put out great albums called Molly Hamner and what's the name of the band, Kurt? And Molly Hamner and the Midnight Tokers. I thought they changed the name, but they didn't. And they named it Midnight Tokers after Steve Miller Band song. Yeah. So those are the two bands I would really love to interview, and probably lots more.
Yeah. There's so many out there still. You know, it's an interesting question, an interesting answer too. Yeah. Anyone else have any other questions for Lori? Because we have about 5 minutes before the next thing that's in this room. So yes.
Yes.
I'm curious, you were interviewing, well, especially the Beatles before social media, and if they wanted to speak to fans, it sort of had to go through you.
Absolutely.
How do you think the sort of musicians or folks are relating to journalism and, I don't know, their fans differently? With, you know, they don't necessarily need to sit with a journalist for hours to put their spin on who broke up their band.
Absolutely. They don't. So it's very different now. And it would be interesting for me to figure out how to do interviews and make them really great these days. So that's why I'll probably still keep thinking about my previous interviews and writing about them and talking about them.
I would think that it might be somewhat, since John, you know, it might be somewhat harder to get through to somebody too. You know, there's just there's many more layers between you and the celebrity. You know, even if you're legitimately a journalist doing your job, that you still have to jump through a lot of hoops to get the interview with the big names because everybody's had to increase security and increase their paranoia, unfortunately. So I would imagine that's part of the deal, you know. So we've got a couple more minutes, but if you want to buy a book, Lori has some down here, and she's going to be back upstairs on the 9th floor if you don't have time now. But I want to, Ken Womack is going to be in here next talking about the Beatles and the tingle factor. He will tell you what that means.
And I should mention that Ken Womack is one of the biggest fans of my book, and he wrote the foreword to my book, and it's super complimentary, and he's a great writer, and he also recorded his foreword for my self-voiced audiobook version. So Ken Womack's great.
Ken is back there, and it's going to be a very interesting panel coming in next. So, Lori, thank you so much for telling us about your
My
book and your
pleasure.
life.
Thank you.
And playing us as wonderful experts. I hope everybody enjoyed Lori's talk, and I also hope that you will come speak to her and buy a book if you haven't got one. And
would anybody like to check it out now?
Okay.
Yeah, please.
We can do that. We have to sort of go to the side to do that.
Okay.
We will definitely do that. Thank you very much, Lori. I appreciated talking
My
with you.
pleasure. Thank you
It was
so
lovely.
much.